All right, everyone. I'd say let's get started. Very warm hello and welcome. I thank each and every one of you for taking some time out of your day to join us here on this next installment of PortaOne's MVNO Academy. I appreciate you make some time for it. It shows that you're interested, obviously, in the topic, that you hope that you may find some insightful, that you find this topic insightful, that you may want to learn something from it. So we hope, Owen and I, we hope that we'll achieve this here in this webinar. So our hosts, or joining me as our host today, is one of our partners that we've been working with for a long time, Owen Griffith from Pharos in Johannesburg, based in Johannesburg. And Owen, if you could just briefly introduce yourself, if you don't mind, and Pharos.
Yeah, thanks very much, Klaus. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate your time. Just a brief introduction about myself and my company. So Pharos is as Klaus said, a Johannesburg-based telco software provider. We've been in business for over 25 years, focusing primarily on the mobile network market, and recently the MVNE and MVNO space as well. We have a vast array of products. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the pertinent ones that in particular that we're going to speak about today is policy control and how that works with online charging and the benefits that you can derive from that. We're about 40 people. We work in a sort of a hybrid flow. We've got people all over the country, but most of us are based here in Joburg, including myself. And look forward to spending a bit of time with you today, and hopefully you get something out of it. You learn a little bit more about this space and what benefits policy control, when combined with online charging, can offer you and your customers. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Owen. So jumping right in, let's take a quick look at our agenda for today and maybe give you a bit of a preview of what's to come. I think we have the session for about 45 minutes or so, with some time allocated for questions and answers. So just to give you a heads up. So the topic being online charging and policy control in an African context. Why are we having this conversation? Why do we have it now? So just to kind of set the stage, I want to just kind of share, and I've seen sort of the folks registering for the webinar. We see a large liberalization in the telco market, especially in Africa, in a lot of African countries. Nigeria is obviously one example, but there's many others. So we do see lots of businesses, lots of service providers becoming interested to mobile services on becoming MVNOs or MVNEs. Consumers are now also quite familiar with the concept of MVNOs. So that's why we do see quite a large spike in interest in folks trying to learn, hey, is this for me? Should I launch one? Am I capable? What is necessary? What are the requirements of becoming an MVNO? And also, I've talked about this over the years. MNOs, as the operators, are oftentimes, they're just naturally larger, more complex organizations, which in my mind always leaves opportunities for agile, smaller operators to start MVNO plays and become successful. But we hope what you learn or what you hear today on the session here allows you to maybe add to your own research and for you to hopefully become successful when you decide to launch an MVNO or MVNO. And also, I just want to mention, I've seen lots of participants here from the African region, but I also see that some others have joined. So I just want to make sure all of it, what we're discussing today, is indeed in an African context, but of course, it's very much applicable to other global markets. So in terms of the agenda, just to briefly introduce Pharos and PortaOne, I know Owen has already talked a little bit about Pharos. I'll do the same about PortaOne for those of you that do not know us yet. And then the rest, or the bulk of the session, will actually be more of an interview. So we're not going to bore you with a lot of slides or anything, but we hope to maybe just have an open conversation between Owen and I, and also invite questions from you along. So we may not wait till the question and answers at the end. So I do encourage you to ask your questions throughout, and we may just pick up right away on those questions and discuss them. But the highlight, or sort of the focus point, will be just the conversation, and with the main topic of policy control and online charging. And at the very end, we'll do a quick recap, question and answers of those that we have not been able to cover. And we at PortaOne, we also have a quick small gift to share for those of you on your journey becoming MVNO and MVNE. So before we jump in, I actually, and this might be interesting to many of you joining also, is who else is participating in this webinar. And PortaOne is organizing this series here and has a few installments later on this year. So quite curious to see if, so I'm going to have just a quick poll here to get a sense of who is joining us today. End this poll here and also share the results. So for those of you, if you're interested to see who else is participating. So there's our answer. So it seems to be that the majority of you are existing service providers looking to add mobile services. So thanks again for answering that. It's quite interesting. All right, so let's get back to it. And I think we're jumping right into our conversation. Owen, the first question that I wanted to ask you, as mentioned, the session specifically aims to discuss MVNO or MVNE plays in an African context. But in your mind, what are some of the differences between mobile industries in African countries and elsewhere? Are there any important regional differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in my opinion, there are a number of key differences. And before I get to those, Africa as a continent in particular is often misunderstood by European and American companies. They tend to think that what works in the US or in Europe will just automatically work in Africa, and that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's really the case. So to answer your question, there's about 5 or 6 things that come to mind. One of the big differences between Africa and other places is that there's generally quite a low level of fixed line penetration. Mm-hmm. It's a result of a number of factors which aren't necessarily that important, but as a result, mobile networks, when they are started up, tend to attract a very large customer base very quickly, and they tend to become dominant. So you normally have your first mover advantage, often the case in many African countries. And because there's a latent demand for communication, right? People need to transact, and people need to do business. People need to stay in touch. We're humans. We need to communicate. So mobile networks tend to be much bigger than the fixed line operators in Africa. Another huge point where it's you do find this in other parts of the world, but it's especially common in Africa, is that it's predominantly a prepaid market. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I don't think I need to get into. I'm sure most of you know this already. But as a direct consequence of it being prepaid, it implies that you need a real-time charging, right? So an OCS requirement is absolutely necessary. Postpaid billing is very much, I don't want to say a thing of the past, but it's certainly not that popular in this part of the world, or it's a very small part of the market. And with prepaid comes, a whole bunch of benefits for the consumer, but a whole bunch of challenges for the network operators or the MVNOs, or MVNEs for that matter. Doing things in real time is a little bit harder than doing it and collecting CDRs and mediating, rating, and sending out a monthly bill. That in itself has got its own set of challenges, but doing things in real time necessitates a different mindset. We'll get into a little bit of that as we go. Some other things that come to mind: mobile money is very popular in Africa. Mm-hmm. And of course, you have young populations that are large. A large proportion of the population are, under 20 years of age. And then something interesting, but not necessarily pertinent to this conversation, is that feature phone penetration is still extremely high. Obviously, when we talk about online charging, that is relevant when it comes to feature phones. Policy control, a little bit less so, but not completely irrelevant. And one of the key drivers, and I've seen this over many years, I've been involved in a number of startups in Africa, and feature phones are dominant because, well, they're cheap, obviously. But some of the lesser spoken about reasons that really drives the adoption of the feature phone is they have very good battery life. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to be charging the thing all the time. And because it's a lower power device, it uses 2G generally. You have very good coverage that comes with 2G. And of course, it's, I can tell you many stories, and we don't have time here, but it's not the end of the world when you drop your phone in the sea, or it's damaged and you're not using a $2,000 smartphone. So feature phones very much. I think that sums up what I would say that really represent key differences between Africa. If you take that combination of things, I think that's quite unique.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think some of the things that you touched on, like the larger, younger populations and sort of the predominance of prepaid, I mean, we see that in other parts of the world, but maybe the combination of all these factors that you mentioned might just present a fairly unique market, and also fairly unique opportunity, just because there is obviously a large population out there that wants to communicate. I do see we already got one of our first questions, and I do appreciate that. I'll come back to this in a few minutes, if you don't mind, to the first person asking the question. I do appreciate some questions coming in. Owen, I wanted to ask you, so maybe first as a definition for those of you that may not be familiar with it quite yet. So when we talk about online charging, or OCS, so Porta Billing is a software platform for telco operators, is an online charging platform. It's a real-time platform. So online charging, you can equate with real-time charging. So that's the same thing. And Owen, you and I, when we were planning this session, we both felt that online charging and policy control are somewhat a bit on a deeper level, or somewhat more technical concepts. We can obviously use those, or MVNOs can use those to differentiate themselves from the competition. But what are some of the things that maybe those aspiring MVNOs or MVNEs need to tackle beforehand, before even getting to the topic of online charging and policy control?
Yeah, that's a really important topic because, just to give you some context with previous engagements that I've had with prospective customers is everybody thinks they need to have an MVNO because it's fashionable and it's happening and I feel left out, and jump into, deep technical discussions about how to implement this. But to your question, Klaus, there are a bunch of things that you really need to ask yourself before embarking on this journey. So in no particular order, you've got to really define what is your target market, what is important for the customers in that market, and then a really big one is, why would they choose your product as an MVNO over the competition? And a sort of an adjacent question would be, why would they leave an existing network operator to churn to your MVNO, right? Exactly. Those are very difficult questions to answer. And there's, once you've got those kind of figured out in your mind, then you've got to look at what does the wholesale proposition look like with an operator that you intend to partner with. What are the margins available to you? What are the obligations and what do those commercial terms look like? It varies from operator to operator. Some of them are quite friendly. Some are a little bit more onerous and demanding, and certain commitments required and credit guarantees and the like. So you've really got to do your homework commercially before you start diving into the tech, right?
Right.
And then I think also you need to define what would constitute a successful MVNO, right?
Exactly.
There's not a single answer to that. You have to decide ahead of time so that you can at least quantify whether you're on track to achieving your goals or if you have in fact achieved your goal. One of the possibilities, and this is, just a thought, is that maybe success for you means that you get acquired by the host operator, right? You take such a chunk of their base away that they want to get it back, so they'll buy you out. That's not you shouldn't be embarrassed to ask questions like that. It's a distinct possibility, but by no means the only prospective outcomes, right? So those are some of the questions I think you need to.
I think it's interesting, Owen, because I multiple conversations I had over the years at industry events and so on. I oftentimes felt that with MNOs, operators being large and complex, a little bit more slow to bring products to market. Someone actually in the US and North America here mentioned this to me, that oftentimes the operator sees an MVNE or enabling MVNEs, MVNOs is a way for them to just kind of test the market, to let them try out various things, let them find a niche for new mobile service offerings and see what's successful. Have maybe 10, 15 MVNOs on your network, and then see which one is successful, and the ones that are successful get maybe reacquired into the fold of the MNO.
Absolutely. This has happened many times where operators will build a kind of an alternative brand that actually is behind the scenes actually the same operator, but in order to not be perceived as competing with themselves, they have the freedom to try some new things that they would otherwise not be able to do, given their existing product portfolio and brand. Yeah.
And maybe picking up on the question that we got from one of our audience members, the question was raised specifically asking about Red Bull Connect in South Africa. That I guess there was an MVNO, it didn't seem to have worked out, and they pulled out. Do you know sort of any details about this particular case? Were you familiar with that?
Yeah, so I'm aware of most of the MVNO efforts that have happened in South Africa. I don't know particularly why they didn't make it, but I can tell you why some of the others didn't work out. There is I wouldn't say a high failure rate, but let's just say a significant chance of failure if you don't get it right. And one of the reasons why MVNOs fail is they fail to recognize what I call the three golden rules of an MVNO. Is if you want to be successful, if you get these three things right, then you have a very good chance of success. And the first one is to leverage an existing brand, a large brand that has a loyal following. That's the first point. And the second one is to speak to the addressable market that relates to that brand. So you need the brand and the scale of that potential market. And then you have to offer some compelling value proposition that would attract people from either new customers who never before had a SIM or a mobile phone, or attracting people to churn. And I'm speaking in general terms and just from experience, is that if you're missing one of those things, then the odds are stacked against you, right, in terms of success. But to start a new MVNO that has no brand identity, whilst it's not impossible, you need to have a very compelling value proposition to kind of make up for that. If you can do those three things in sort of equal measure, then in my opinion, you have a very good chance of success. So to answer the question, it was probably one of those reasons, or for one of those reasons, or lack of one of those, that they didn't make it. Other very large brands like Virgin Mobile, they were at one stage the largest MVNO in SA, and they aren't around either. So again, I don't have the detail, and even if I did, I wouldn't necessarily want to share. But there are a few cases to be made of why they didn't make it.
I appreciate you sharing it. Thanks for the insight. So let's maybe pivot a little bit towards the actual topic of online charging policy control. Can you maybe help us directly understand or describe in a bit more details what those two things are, online charging and policy control?
Yeah, sure.
And why are they important to aspiring?
Okay. So firstly, let me say that there are two very different things, and sometimes people conflate the two, or they confuse the role of one over the other. So let's just talk briefly about online charging, and the key to what it actually is really in the name, OCS, right? Online meaning real time, as you mentioned, Klaus. It's synonymous. Online charging and real time charging is one and the same thing. Online charging, it's easy to say that, but there's actually a number of factors that need to come together to make online charging possible. So obviously you need a real-time interface feed from the core network that basically requests authorization for the service, and then checks the available credit, and then grants units to be used that are commensurate with the amount of credit that's available, right? And that means that there's a real-time rating function as well. Now, rating and charge are not the same thing either. So your policy controller is it's a software component in the core network that speaks to the OCS and also speaks to your packet gateway. So specifically, a policy controller governs the product behavior, the data session behavior for mobile data sessions specifically. So you don't use a policy controller for SMS. You don't use it for voice calls. The equivalent policy controller for voice calls would be your IN node, roughly. So what a policy controller can do based on rules that you define as the administrator of the policy controller is you govern the behavior of data sessions based on certain conditions and certain triggers that you either receive from the network or from the charging system. So, for example, you could craft a solution that restricts your bit rate once you exceed a certain usage threshold. Maybe if you're doing a fixed wireless offering, you could use it to implement a fair usage policy, for example. You could use it to zero rate certain traffic. Maybe you want to your customers not to pay when they use your app, or they visit your website, or they recharge. Purchasing airtime. If they don't have airtime to use their device, you should allow them to access your portal in the absence of any credit, and you can enable that with your policy controller. Now, of course, you can do that on an OCS as well, but the trick with the policy controller is that it allows you to put some controls around how much zero-rated traffic you allow your customer to have. And this is a very important point. Whenever you zero-rate a resource in the best interests of your customer, sometimes always it will backfire, and people will find ways of exploiting that zero-rated resource using tunneling protocols, ping tunnel, DNS tunnel, and the like. So you allocate a certain quota of zero-rated traffic per day or per week or per month, just so that you allow the benefit of having zero-rated traffic for your customer without opening up massive holes, fraud and revenue holes in your network when charging system. You don't want to get a big wholesale bill for traffic that you can't recover from your customer. So it helps you put some controls around how services behave, and you can also craft very interesting products and services using policy controller. But I think I've touched on it at a high level. If you can imagine a triangle with policy controller, online charging system, and your packet gateway, and they're each talking to each other using various network protocols, and it's a highly cooperative thing. Your packet gateway talks to your policy controller talks to your charging system, and your charging system talks to the packet gateway. I don't want to get into diagrams or go too deep on the tech. I mean, we can if people have questions. I think that's all good, and I think it goes back on to what we discussed earlier, that it's super and so important. I think folks that we talk to have the tendency to get into technical concepts and so on. But what we always highlight on the PortaOne side when we get a chance to speak with aspiring MVNOs, MVNEs, is to really make sure to like we said before, to crystallize on the business case, to really have a good understanding of who your customers are, how you're trying to help them, and to make sure you refine your product first, and then let Pharos, let PortaOne help you to say or design, to craft this is the business idea that we want to do. How can we do this? How can we implement this with the technical concepts, with the technical platforms that we have? Yeah. If I can just add to that, it's how can you do that safely? Because you've it's just the reality on networks. The possibility for fraud to happen when you create certain services with unintended consequences, and the policy controller, in conjunction with your charging system, when you sit down and you design these things and you factor those in, you can build those into your product rules. so that bad things don't happen. Well, yeah.
I'm curious. I'm curious here to maybe pick up on that, and Owen, just to kind of ask you. So, obviously, with your experience over the last 20 years or so, are there still surprises to you? Like, do you still get surprised by exploits or abuses or creative use, I should say, of? Do you still get surprised, or?
Now and again, you hear of an unintended consequence, where, and it's why I keep going back to the zero-rated services and how careful you need to be when putting those together. You can do it safely, but you have to be very deliberate about it. Mm-hmm. I'll give you one example of an unintended consequence. I won't mention any names, but when you look at MMS as a traffic case, right? So for MMS, multimedia messaging, operators tend to charge for the actual message, much as you would for an SMS. It is a fixed charge regardless of the size of the message. And the charging records or the charging requests to the OCS would come directly from the MMSC. And now, in order to prevent the customer who's using MMS from also being charged for the mobile data, you want to zero rate the mobile data that's associated with that MMS service. Right. So, for example, if you're sending a message, not the end of the world when you maybe get billed for the data as well, although you shouldn't, but certainly when you're receiving a message, the charging paradigm in Africa, and it's different in other parts of the world, is that the receiver doesn't pay anything. Right. Not for the usage, and not for the message itself. Yeah. And what happened in this particular case is that the MMS traffic was zero rated, but the actual URL in the DPI classification was not fully qualified. And if you appended some extra characters onto the end of that URL and then pointed it to a tunneling proxy, then people started, internet data traffic shot through the roof and revenue went flat. And it took a few days to pick up on this and to figure out what had happened. It was a very easy fix to just fully qualify the URL that's used for the MMS service. Yep. But it's just something to watch out for whenever you zero rate. And again, we don't have the time. I can tell you lots of cool stories about similar things. But suffice it to say, when people discover an exploit, it goes viral. Mm-hmm. And, every man and his dog starts getting free data.
Yes.
And
Well, thanks for sharing. It's much appreciated. So coming maybe to, we talked a little bit about online charging policy control. So maybe what are some of those innovative differentiated data products that MVNOs can launch using those two concepts, and maybe just on a high level, just to kind of explain of maybe what's available, combining platforms from Pharos and PortaOne, what can you do with it to differentiate yourself?
Yeah, okay, that's a good one. So what's particularly popular at the moment from a differentiation perspective is to create, as an MVNO, to create products that allow you to bundle certain social media services together, and maybe you can sell a voucher for, let's say, Facebook, right?
Yeah.
That allows you to use unlimited Facebook for a fixed charge for a period.
Right.
And when you combine policy control and OCS, the OCS allows you to create the product and to allow the customer to purchase that. And then what would happen is your policy controller would instruct your packet gateway that when it sees traffic that is classified as Facebook, then it must deplete the Facebook bundle that the customer has purchased and not the normal default data bundle.
Right.
Then when that's exhausted, it would revert back to your normal airtime wallet. Yeah. And it very much depends on the host operator having the DPI the deep packet inspection capability, and the relationships with vendors that provide the signatures and the traffic classification rules that are updated so frequently to keep abreast of, what does WhatsApp traffic look like? What does Facebook traffic look like? What does Instagram? Right. These things are, HTTPS, and they're very hard to classify, but they are vendors that do this, and they do it very well. So if you have that capability with your host network, you can craft those products on your charging system and your policy controller, and create a bit of differentiation, perhaps, if your competition are maybe not offering it, or offering it at a much higher price point.
I could see how, maybe coming back to what you said earlier, Owen, about partnering with established brands, I could see how, if you do partner up with an established brand, like maybe a retail brand or a financial services a brand, that could then be used to maybe even reward customer loyalty, to say, look, if you bank with us for X amount of months, we'll give you free WhatsApp social bundles, for 2 months, and so on. So I think, and that's I think what consumers are looking for, is to have those sort of unique and creative offerings that might help you differentiate yourself from, hey, I'm just offering data, voice, and SMS for slightly cheaper than the other guy.
Yeah. So just offering lower tariffs isn't necessarily going to guarantee you business. You need to have a compelling value proposition. And to your point about rewarding customer loyalty, I know of many examples where MVNOs have partnered with a big brand, and as part of the value proposition, when you spend a certain amount per month on your groceries, you get some of that back instead of a voucher to use on your next purchase. Maybe that can be some data, or a social bundle, or some airtime even.
Right.
Yeah, and you keep your customer in that ecosystem. You keep them in the walled garden, so to speak, and you try to offer as much value as possible. Not necessarily to make money on the MVNO itself, although obviously you do want to turn a profit, or at the very least you want to break even. But if you, going back to your earlier point, you've got to have a compelling reason to move from another provider, and that's the kind of thing you have to think about before you even start. Mm-hmm. The rest of it is design and engineering, about fulfilling the design brief, that you have in mind, and not the other way around.
No, exactly. Okay, very good. Owen, I suggest we're coming up here to the hour, even with the short interruptions. So maybe what we can do, I pull up our quick recap slide, and I'm going to open the floor. We did have one question so far, but I just wanted to encourage everyone that's participating, if you still have an additional question, and now would be the time. You can use either the Zoom Q&A app, or you can use the webinar chat. Feel free to use either of them. Works for us. Just as a quick recap from our point of view, we just wanted to make sure that if you have a business idea of launching an MVNO and MVNE, feel free to reach out to Pharos. Feel free to reach out to PortaOne. Tap into our expertise. We're happy to help you with, whatever you might be planning. So let us know. We can assist with some of your plans. And I just wanted to, as I mentioned earlier during the agenda, so I do have a quick Q&A slide here as well. While maybe some questions are coming in, maybe not, that's okay too. In case you do want to learn more, there are my team members just this morning actually shared one excellent new resource hub that I wanted to share with you here. So if you want to learn more about MVNOs, what makes MVNOs successful, what are some of the things that PortaOne has done, what are some of the things that PortaOne and Pharos have worked together, what is the expert insight that might be helpful to your specific scenario, to your specific business that you're planning, please head over to our new MVNO resource hub. Our marketing team has shared the URL in the chat here. And yeah, you might, well, hopefully find something there. There is actually one question here, and that's actually quite interesting, Owen. So if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind that bounce off you. So the question is, why create MVNOs in Africa when they are disappearing in Europe? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a very interesting. So let me just go back a little bit. So yeah, Africa is different to Europe, and there's one fundamental difference above all else, and that is the margins in Africa are significantly higher than the margins in Europe, mainly as a function of lack of competition. So there's more room to maneuver in the African markets than there is in Europe, and that would be my take on why they come in Europe so quickly. Because and there's other reasons. Maybe it's because they didn't have a compelling value proposition. As it says, not enough just to be cheaper. You need to offer something more, and something that your customer can connect with and relate to. So yeah, Africa is a very lucrative market, and such a large addressable market. A lot of it is untapped, and it's
still underserved, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, the MVNOs are really starting to gain traction in South Africa, but there are other parts of Africa where it's starting to happen as well.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of growth in this area, and this continent in particular is, I think, a good place for MVNOs to succeed.
There's one question here, Owen. We may not have all the details that we can share here, but I just wanted to ask you anyway. So the question is, what are the financial considerations, projections, including initial investment, operating costs, revenue stream, and profitability timelines for launching, sustaining an MVNO business? I mean, this is probably a question we could discuss for hours on end. Yeah. And we may not even have all the details, just to, as vendors to the actual MVNO, we obviously are oftentimes lucky enough to be in a position to work with both the operator and the MVNO, but at the same time, we lack certain details and specifics about the wholesale agreements and so on. But do you have something that could help for this question?
Yeah, it's a very big question. I think it really starts with the conversation with the MNO and that wholesale agreement. It's all about that wholesale agreement. And I know from my own experience with other MVNOs in the space is that it took them a number of iterations to get to a point where they could negotiate meaningfully with their host network to get a better deal. Often what gets initially put on the table is just, there's not enough meat on the bone, or the MVNOs are not incentivized enough, or and the rates do come down. There's been many iterations. Again, I won't quote any numbers, but it is a bit of a fight that you need to have with your host operator. And of course, what a lot of MVNO has done is they will put out an RFP to say, well, vendor A, B, and C, give me your wholesale, rates, and why must I come and, use you as my host network? So you can flip that around. You're not always at the mercy of what the MVNO is offering. You can make it very competitive as well, and they have. Again, I can, without mentioning names, this has happened many times and been successful.
And maybe also from my end to add to that, what I think helps these days is with cloud technologies becoming more and more common. I do see that the initial investment and the ongoing operational costs have come down over the years. Yeah. So this, whereas previously launching an MVNO, maybe even 5-6 years ago, might have meant upfronting capital expenses of millions of dollars for certain software licenses, hardware, and so on. Nowadays, with software as a service and cloud technologies, you can do a lot with a lot less.
Absolutely. The barriers to entry have lowered significantly. And what's happened with a lot of infrastructure providers and software providers, ourselves included, is that we have subscription-based commercial models that sort of pay as you grow. So you don't have to do those massive upfront CapEx investments, which could take years to recover and maybe never recover. So, the industry around the operators and companies like Porta and Pharos have recognized that, and we have made it possible to get into the space without having to spend a huge amount of money upfront. Obviously, there's some upfront investment, but it's tiny compared to what it used to be even 5 years ago. It would have just been impossible for a lot of the MVNOs that are out there today to have started 5 years ago with the costs as they were. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Owen, and thanks everyone for your questions. Those are actually very, very good questions. Difficult to answer from our end, but we hope that we gave you at least some insight, some advice here to help you on your journey. So if there's any other questions after we end the session, as I said before, please feel free to reach out to PortaOne, to Pharos. If you don't have Owen's contact details, please reach out to us. We'll be happy to obviously share his contacts and Pharos's details. And I thank every one of you for attending. Thanks for taking some time. There was one very last minute question here. Regulatory requirements and licenses are necessary to operate an MVNO in Africa and the US. I mean, this obviously depends a little bit on each country, but yes, in summary, from my perspective, there's always going to be some telco license needed. In the US, for instance, you go through an FCC process. In Nigeria, there was I think they auctioned it off, I believe, or you could apply for a license of various levels. So there's always going to be some licensing requirement in order for you to comply with the regulatory requirements.
Absolutely. If I can just add to that, Klaus, the one thing that you generally will not be required to pay for is a spectrum license. The spectrum license is held by the host MNO. Yes. Those are very, very pricey.
Yeah.
So it really varies tremendously from territory to territory. But yes, there is always some licensing required, but generally not the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Owen, thank you very much for attending. Very much appreciated. And we'll speak soon. And for each and every one of you attending, thank you so much for your questions. Thanks so much for taking your time. And if there's anything else, please reach out to us at PortaOne.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this. I really appreciate it.
All right. Cheers. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.